Welcome to the Windrush Caribbean Film Festival podcast. The journey continues. I'm award-winning journalist Nadine Drummond. On today's episode, we discuss the Windrush Generation's legacy, the lies told, and what we've learned from it. We're joined by two of its most honourable descendants, Patrick Vernon OBE and Professor Les Henry. Tune in and follow our socials for more.
So I'd like to start by asking each of you to please introduce yourself. Les, please take it away.
Right, so my name is Professor William Alistair Anthony Henry, also known as Leslie Lyrics. Most people call me Prof. Les, but I'm a PhD in sociology, sort of sociology, anthropology. And until January this year, I was a professor of criminology and sociology at London University. At the moment, I'm a private research consultant and I run my own research consultancy, PWH Consultancy Services Limited.
Thank you. And now for you, Patrick Vernon OBE, please introduce yourself.
Hi there, I'm Patrick Vernon. I've got various titles like Les. I'm not going to give my full name. He's got more than me, actually, first names. But so I'm Patrick Vernon. I was made honorary professor. I'm pro-chancellor of Wolverhampton University, the place where I was born. I do lots of stuff. I chair an NHS organisation in Birmingham and Solihull. I do lots of stuff around, like Leslie, around Black history, but also I do a lot of stuff around activism, particularly around mental health. And then I've been involved in different aspects of campaigning around Windrush.
Why is it important, Patrick? Why are you campaigning around Windrush? Why should we care?
Good question. Why should we care? Because if we don't care, then we don't acknowledge the contribution of our elders. I mean, Windrush itself is often, people have different perspectives on Windrush. I see Windrush as one chapter in the Black experience in the UK, and so particularly this is a current history and it's ongoing history. And so I just look at my parents. Both my parents are still alive, I'm lucky. They're both in their 90s. They came from Jamaica to the Midlands in the 1950s. And that generation is disappearing, literally. I mean, every other week I'm going to some funeral of an elder. I went to John Richards, who died recently. I went to part of his funeral. He was 96 years old. He was actually one of the very few passengers that went on the Windrush ship. I don't know how many of them are still alive. But probably about 2 or 3 still alive, actually. So this history is important. It's current history. It's migration history. It's a history which has shaped not just the Caribbean experience. It's actually shaped Britain in many ways. If we look at all walks of life, the Windrush generation have contributed significantly, but that history has never been acknowledged, never been valued. You have various organisations over the years that try. I've done work on that around the Windrush Foundation, Arthur Torrington, late Sam King. I made a film in 2008 about one particular elder called Eddie Martin Noble, who served in the Second World War. He didn't see himself as Windrush per se because he was pre-Windrush, but I think the key thing was about that mass migration that came from the Caribbean and then later from Africa, which have shaped Britain in many ways, to be quite honest, and definitely places like London, Manchester, Bristol, place I grew up in Wolverhampton, where I work in Birmingham as well. So I think it's significant history. That's why I've been involved, not just on the historical side, but more recently I was involved around the whole stuff around the scandal, the Home Office Windrush scandal, which denied people's rights as citizens, which had...
Stick a pin, Patrick.
Okay.
Prof. Les, why should we care whether we're descended from Caribbean people or directly from Africa, or we're other types of, or we comprise other different kind of ethnic groups from the Caribbean? Why should we care about Windrush? What's the big deal about?
Well, to me, there's a few points of clarification, and I agree with Patrick when he spoke about the serviceman that he interviewed who didn't want to be locked into the Windrush. And for me, this is the point. My parents, peace be upon them, they're both dead. They came here. My dad got here in 51, I think it was. My mum joined him in 52. And yes, the Windrush generation, and we know about the landing of the ship and all the problems that they face. Hopefully we'll unpack some of that. But for me, it's important to focus on what Patrick said about this being a chapter. The danger is being collapsed into that historical moment, which for me, a lot of the celebratory stuff did. I wrote a lyric in the late 90s where I said, before me join in on the celebration, let me tell you about the Windrush Generation. Just like the slaves on the plantation, them use it for build up the whole of England, which they had destroyed in them contention, the tribal wars of the European. Because we were being trapped in that moment as if we didn't have a viable or visible presence here, where we know that Africans have been here for over 2,000 years. Queen Elizabeth I wanted to deport Africans. We're talking 15th century or 16th century, whenever it was. So I think we need to be very clear on just fixing that title to a particular historical experience, because our history cannot be trapped into that moment. In fact, Sister Audrey on Arira Records wrote a track called Don't Call Me an English Girl. It was released in 1987. Mad Prof re-released it a couple of years ago, because in that track, Sister Audrey says, you invited us over, and now 40 years later, you want us to get some papers. The crucial point there is, I have family members, you talk about the African Caribbean experience. I have family members, and I know many people, like one of my daughters, my oldest daughter's mother, who came to England when she was 9, they wanted to deport her when she was in her 30s because they said she didn't have the right documentation. She did all her schooling here, all her training here. She was a qualified midwife, etc., etc. So the reality of this cannot be just trapped into Windrush. This is a post-chattel enslavement reality. It's ongoing.
Aren't we talking about two different things then? Because, or can't two things be true at the same time? In that, yes, we've been here documented from probably the 14th, at least as early as the 14th century, and we can't allow the acknowledgement of what's called the Windrush Generation to limit our cultural contributions to Britain going back that far. But isn't it really also important to highlight the fact that during this microcosm of our history as British history, that a group of people en masse post-war came from across the Caribbean to help rebuild what was then the mother country? Because I'm sure all of our parents were born British. My mum was the first person ever to get a Jamaican passport. I also have a Jamaican passport now by birthright, but my mum was the first person since all of her family being born on the island of Jamaica to be Jamaican. So shouldn't there be a celebration of that? What do you think, Patrick?
Well, just to build up, people met this because I've been involved in Windrush, and people have called me, because I did a campaign for National Windrush Day and stuff like that. But as Les said, and I said, it's one chapter. So I did a campaign going back nearly 25 years ago now, 100 Great Black Britons, to acknowledge the Black presence in Britain, going back from Septimus Severus, AD 287 to Miss Dynamite. That was the long arc of our history and contribution. But I think what's happened is because our long history has not been validated and recognised. It's a bit more now. So when I got involved around doing the campaign work around Windrush, the history, it's just acknowledging that contribution as part of a longer contribution history. But I think what happened during the time of the Windrush scandal, and when the great British public realised that, number one, we came here and we contributed, then everyone got focused on that. So yes, I've been involved in elements of that, but I've not been a sycophant in the sense of it. And I think we have to acknowledge that, because in between the contribution, there's been a pain as well. And part of that pain has been the scandal, which is still ongoing, by the way, in that sense. And I've always said that when the government did agree to a Windrush Day, even though people had been celebrating Windrush Day many years, to be quite honest, the Huntleys, they used to organise Windrush Day events in Ealing back in the late 1990s. Stuff was happening in the Midlands, stuff was happening in London, in South London, with Sam King and others as well. But when the government acknowledged it, that's when it almost like people thought, oh, now we can now. That's when I think it got carried away, because unfortunately, this is part of our history. When we do stuff, we lose that agency. And when you lose that agency, then people will interpret your history on your behalf for you. And that's been part of the battle. I mean, that's why, Gus John has been skeptic, and I can see why he's doing that, because some of that agency has been taken away, and it's overtaken completely from the true essence of what we did and our contributions, which is actually not just simply around Windrush, but it's actually our contributions if we look at the history of enslavement as well.
So let me ask a different question, and I'm going to posit this to you first, Prof. Les. Why is it a scandal, and why are we all acting brand new based on the treatment of people of Caribbean descent in this country, particularly Black people? Why are we still calling Windrush a scandal? Isn't this something that we would expect?
Well, to be honest, I'm not one of the people who even endorse this notion of the scandal. And for me, when I think about the treatment, it is ongoing. It's never changed. In fact, Prof. Gus has got a PDF that he's just published. I think I sent it to you today. About 80 years later, let's make Britain white again. And he presents a historiography of our treatment in the context of the UK over the last 80 years. Now, the salient point for me there is the Windrush wasn't a scandal, and that's one of the reasons why, I put that in a lyric in 1990 something, because those of us who live the experience of what it is to be Black, and particularly born in the womb of a very scornful mother country, we appreciate that it's not a scandal, it's an ongoing lived reality. So to give it particular context, Keir Starmer came out with, he wants, what is it? The Aspiration Nation. Do you remember when he came out with that? And he did that as a way to sanction who is skilled enough to come to Britain. And you can hear me getting emotional about this, because I thought that is one of the rankest things I've ever heard. And why these black-faced politicians didn't pull him up is beyond me. And the reason I say that, and Prof. Gus deals with this in this paper, when my mother came over here, she was a machinist. She could not get a job doing that. She ended up in a factory, working in factories or sweeping offices. That's what she did. They didn't care about what our qualifications were then, because our purpose was to rebuild this country. But more importantly, if people really want to understand the history of why we came here en masse, it was nothing to do with coming to the mother country because the streets were paved with gold. We used to go to America and other places as so-called swallow migrants. They need to look at the McCarran-Walter Act, which stopped something like how many thousands of Jamaicans and people from the Caribbean from working in America? Because after the Second World War, they didn't want us in America. So they put legislation to curtail that migration, which is why we ended up here in a mother country. That is the context that people need to appreciate, in my humble opinion. So when Keir Starmer comes off with his rankness about Aspiration Nation, who were more aspiring than we were? If you want to look at the Windrush, look at the people, the skills that were transported on that one ship, just that ship alone. But what jobs did they get? A good friend of ours, whose father passed last year, peace be upon him, came from Montserrat. He was an English master, and then you didn't need a PhD. You needed a master's to be able to work teaching English in a grammar school. He ended up driving buses because they did not recognize his qualifications. So I think we need to be very careful about trapping ourselves in this contemporaneous history that they can say is a scandal. It's not a scandal. It's an ongoing lived reality, because the white people in positions of power are afraid for us to know our history, particularly our involvement in the First World War, Second World War, and what happened post those tribal European conflicts.
And Patrick, thank you, Prof. Les. So Patrick, your film actually highlights that reality of soldiers, World War II soldiers. And that's something that's particularly important to me, because my father was in the British Army for more than 20 years.
Yeah.
So I have a particular soft spot for soldiers, especially those of Caribbean descent. Mm-hmm. Now, we can debate whether or not what happened is actually a scandal or part of the lived experience, but you've got particular experience of the lived experience by some of the people that you've worked with and that you advocate for through your Windrush campaign. So can you talk about how the discrimination, what the discrimination the Windrush defendants or the Windrush victims faced, and how it's impacted them?
Yeah, sure. So just to add to what Les said, the Windrush scandal is no different to other scandals that's happened to Black people in Britain. You can go back, you can see what happened during COVID. You can go back what happened to Child Q. You can go back to Stop and Search. You can go back to Mangrove, New Cross Fires, murder of Stephen Lawrence, Chelsea Cochrane and Notting Hill. You can go far back and look at all these examples. But I think the particular aspects of the Home Office Windrush scandal, and I call it the Home Office scandal because they were the perpetrators, that this affected thousands of people all at the same time who were denied their rights as being citizens. They were British citizens in the first place. People lost their homes. People lost their jobs, and then more worryingly, a number of people have died. We don't know the actual true numbers, but I think in the UK, at least 70 plus people have died connected with hypertension or stress-related illnesses. And then more people have died in the Caribbean, and probably even more people have died in Africa, to be quite honest. So we don't know the true numbers, but some of the people I knew, particularly Paulette Wilson, who was, in many ways, her being detained in Yardswood and the way she was treated by the Home Office kind of epitomised the lived stories, lived experiences of many thousands of people that were experiencing the hostile environment policy. So the reason why it's called a scandal because of that distinctive policy of hostile environment policy, which has been ongoing, to be quite honest, for many decades. But it had a manifestation when the Home Office started targeting particular people. They were seen as low-hanging fruit, and that's why there's so many people, Caribbean people, caught up in the scandal. So people lost their homes, lost their jobs, people were traumatized. People didn't have an impact on the individuals, had an impact on the children and the grandchildren as well. So in some households, 3 generations were traumatized by what happened as well. And so I think the key thing, right, is actually there's been a lot of lawyers, activists, campaigners, people with lived experience still campaign around compensation scheme, still campaign around issues around status. In terms of the Windrush Caribbean Film Festival, you've actually given out awards and recognised individuals who have actually done some of that campaigning work. So myself and Jacqueline McKenzie, who work closely with, were kind of recognised a few years ago. Me and the gentleman and Nadine White and as journalists who helped to cover and expose what had happened as well. So it's an ongoing thing. You might say, well, what's different with this particular injustice to other injustices? I think the difference is, I think for the average person in Britain, if you're living down in Cornwall or Anglesey, you didn't think much about Black people and racism and discrimination. But this, because of the nature and the number of people that were involved, the public were forced to look at the issues of structural racism and its impact on Black people. Because in the past, if it was a death in custody, the average person didn't really care. But the Windrush scandal, because of the way of the history of migration and integration as well, people knew someone or heard of someone either at work, in their church, in their community, or family member connected to the Windrush Generation who were deported or threatened with deportation or lost their jobs. And that's why it kind of resonated with the public in more so, compared to other examples of, I mean, the nearest one before that was probably the murder of Stephen Lawrence, where the public actually acknowledged, oh, a talented black teenager, his life's been taken away by racist folks. So it's one of those few weird moments in history where all of a sudden there is a kind of recognition of our separation, and then we go back to normal again around the ongoing discrimination that we face.
Okay, thank you, Vernon. So, Prof. Les, how do you think that the injustices, which was, as Patrick has said, a denial of the ability to work, people losing their financial security, lots of people lost their homes, people were denied medical interventions. How do you think, one, that impacted the broader Caribbean community in the UK, but also how do you think it allowed us to display our sense of resilience living in this country?
Well, again, for me, what happened in the Windrush, the so-called scandal, just highlighted everyday lived experiences of members of the African Caribbean community. So I'll give you an example. There used to be a African Caribbean mental health project called Family Health ISIS in Catford. It was the oldest one and the first one. And their template was a very simple one. No white people were allowed in that centre. Not even the only white people who were allowed in that centre could come in there to either repair something, and that was it. And I managed that mental health project between 2006 and 2007. And I can tell you for a fact that everything that has supposedly afflicted the people in the Windrush in the context of healthcare, employment, we can put education in there because this will impact people generationally. I witnessed all of those things during that year, 2006 to 2007. What happens is, and in some ways I agree with what Patrick said, it's almost like this shined a beacon on the kind of disproportionality, systemic, institutionalized racist practices we have been, we have had visited upon us, let's say, since we came here, post 48. Let's say post 1948. However, we need to be very mindful, because what a lot of people are doing is they are saying, well, this only impacts the people from the Windrush generation because their citizenship was in question. That's not the case. So we know if you get a black child and a white child, let's say they're 18 years old and they present with the same symptoms if you get a black and a white child in the context of presenting with mental ill health, the white child will get talking therapies, the black child will get the liquid cosh. And I used to have the statistics for that. So I think it's dangerous when people think it only impacts the people who were caught up in the so-called Windrush scandal and everybody else is fine. That's not how systemic and institutionalized racist practices work. It's embedded. I always say this is an inherently racist, classist, and sexist society. Now let's have a conversation. So you're a black woman. You know that as a black woman, you're triple damned. You're damned for being black, you're damned for being a woman, and you're damned for being a black woman. That is the lived reality of living in an institutionalized racist society. So we should never separate that and act as if, oh, everything is all right with everybody else. It's fine. It's only these ones. Because I know black people who were saying, well, they should have applied for their citizenship. Why didn't they do this legitimately? Blah, blah, blah. Not understanding that, remember, one of the parts of the scandal was the Home Office said they couldn't find the original documentation. And yet someone went and dug a load of it out on the British Library. And it was the Asian sister who works for the BBC, Laini Mulkani, who did a series of programs quoting some of those statistics. And this was from, 2007, 2008. So how comes all of a sudden they can't find the stats to prove that these people are actually legitimate citizens? And the last quick point is, remember, they kept changing their nationality and citizenship acts. And it was in 1980, I think it was in 1968, when the British Black Power movements forced them to acknowledge the so-called colour bar, which they said didn't exist in England. And it's interesting because one of the things that Starmer said was there are unwritten laws and written laws that more or less govern the country. The unwritten laws were the ones that legislated against us, like the colour bar, which didn't supposedly exist. So my point is this: let's not think we can divorce ourselves from what that particular cohort, let's call them, experience. That is a wider Black, African Caribbean experience in an inherently racist society, because that is what Britain is. It was built on chattel enslavement.
Thank you, Professor Les. And I think it's really important to understand that history is a process in motion. Now, there have been lots of critiques about the Windrush compensation schemes and how slowly it's moving, and people aren't being given the requisite amount of compensation. But recently there was a decision for Winston Knight, who had been deported 12 years ago, to return to the UK. So, Patrick, do you think that in some way is a change since Yvette, the new person in charge, has allowed him to technically come home?
Now, there are other cases of Winston before this, and there'll be other cases of other Winstons in Jamaica and also in Africa, because part of the problem has been that when Theresa May apologised for the Windrush scandal and they instituted the compensation scheme and the Windrush task force to regularise people's status, they didn't put any proper investment and resources to really inform the people in the Caribbean who were affected. I mean, this has been going for decades, to say, actually, you come back home, or you have the right to come back home. It's only been through journalists and lawyers who have actually been taken action and raised it with the Home Office. So it's not like the Home Office have been in open arms. It's been the opposite, to be quite honest. I think, personally speaking, there's probably more people in Africa entitled to come back and get their status back again and to claim compensation. So I think you're going to hear more stories like this in the years to come. It's still ongoing as well. And I think the key thing is, what Les said, Prof. Les said, talked about ISIS. Actually, the very first mental health project was actually in Lambeth in 1980. And then there were other mental health projects around the country. I worked in mental health, I worked for Mind for a number of years, and another organisation around mental health. And the sufferation, and I use it because I'm actually working on the book, my new book, which I'm hoping will come out next year. I've looked at history of mental health policy from enslavement to Windrush scandal. So there's 400 years of sufferation around our mental health well-being. But what's happened particularly around this is around community trauma. Even people who were not directly affected by the Windrush scandal have also been traumatized about, am I really wanted here? Which is nothing new, but it's even more so now. And with the last two changes, and also the around immigration policy and law of the last government, so what's going to happen now, it's further going to traumatize and make us have a higher degree of fragility around our status and our sense of belonging in this country. And it's not surprising a lot of people now are going back to Africa, looking at the Caribbean or elsewhere to find that sense of peace and somewhere that can be valued and respected. And as Les said,
do you think that that's a direct result of one of the impacts of the Windrush scandal for maybe second or third and fourth generation saying, you know what, let me go back to where my mum or my grandparents come from. Let me try it there.
No, I've known people who've done it, left Britain 20, 30 years ago because of the lack of, the discrimination in the workplace in terms of career progression. I mean, Les, you've worked in academia for a number of years, and you know that some of your colleagues have had to go to America to get gigs to be professors because of discrimination and racism in our higher education system. You know what I mean? And I don't know how. I mean, there's only 105 black women professors in this country. I don't know how many black men there are as professors in this country.
Apparently, the latest stats. Well, when I was included in one of them, if we're talking about PhD professors, there was something like 150, and I think something like about 95 women.
Yeah.
And the rest of women. And we need to be careful here, because these are PhD professors within the social sciences and the humanities. I don't know about the other disciplines.
Okay.
But what I can tell you for a fact, because I wrote an article on this from Dr. Dave Thomas, wonderful brother who does brilliant stuff. And I think it was him and Jason Arday edited a book. And when I was doing the stats at the time, I worked out that post-COVID I think it was 2023, more white women achieved their professorships within that 2-year period than there were black professors.
Yeah, really?
Yeah. And it was something like, I think when I did the research, it was out of 22,500, you had about 150 blacks as tenured professors.
So this is an example. If you look at every sector, higher education, the NHS, I've worked in the NHS, I've worked as a senior director, I chair NHS organ. If you look across the NHS, the biggest employer in Britain, the third biggest employer in the world, you're lucky to see a handful of black people at senior level.
Absolutely.
And if you apply it in housing, you apply it in the civil service, all the sectors, and that's why there's people are saying, well, other people are starting their own businesses or doing else because of the ongoing structural racism. If you remember a guy called Tony Sewell, or he's now Lord Sewell now, he did a report during the height of COVID, called I can't remember
the one on education and all that.
Disparities report, and it basically said three things that it mostly implied that black people are lazy. It more supplied that because if he compared it with other ethnic groups, therefore, that's what he more implied that we don't work hard enough, we're lazy, etc. These kind of racist tropes. Secondly, Britain's a great place to be, basically. And the third thing he also said that during the period of enslavement it was character building for black people to be enslaved. He had to
sorry to cut you, brother Patrick.
Yeah.
One of the outrageous things he said in a voice in the New Nation, I think it was, or whichever paper he wrote for, I think it was The Voice, I don't know, when he said, without slavery, we wouldn't have had jazz or reggae. And I've worked with him a few times, but I think he's an interesting character because sometimes I wonder if it's just because, as we say in Jamaica, as Don said, or he does it to be provocative.
I think
because I've reasoned with him loads of times. But what is interesting about the report that Patrick just cited was I think it was for the first time in the history of British education, I think there was over 500 people from university deans and whatever they were, vice chancellors, right down to school teachers, wrote a letter basically savaging that report, and Absolutely. They signed to it. Yeah,
it wasn't just education. Even the BMA, all the top professional bodies in medicine, because his chapter on health was atrocious. So each sector, it's one of the worst reports you can ever have. But the point I'm trying to make is that the racism that we experience, and the sad thing about it, right? Me and Les were of a certain age, and you'd think by now that there would be a massive the black talent. I mean, last week was Black Talent Week, yeah, and you would think that this black talent would be given opportunity to progress their careers.
Never.
And the third, fourth generation are been okay. Once we've got through, but the majority have been held back. Actually, if you look at the data around unemployment trends and poverty, I'm not even quite sure if the young people are worse off than compared to the time when we were doing our stuff. You know what I mean? So this is the nature. So that's why I try and preface that the Windrush scandal is only one chapter or one link as a wider picture. The reason why it's got that profile, and the reason why you've created the film festival, I think, is to highlight that despite the negativity and the suffering and the pain, we're still trying to do our thing. We still have a degree of agency around what we want to do. Some people might go over the top around the celebration thing, but I think we have to do it in a way that acknowledges, our parents, our grandparents, they're sacrificed. And when people said they were invited, they were sort of invited, but not really invited. They were, you know what I mean? They were semi-invited.
Coercion. And sorry, Patrick, but on that point, and I know it's really interesting because there's a book by Horace Campbell called Rasta and Resistance.
Yes, classic.
Well, he's got an excellent piece in there about why people came here.
Yeah.
Because at one point, what they did in Jamaica, I think it was in it was after the Second World War. But what they did was, because they needed more people to work in finance, bank, education in Kingston, they opened the door to people from the country who were supposed to be less educated. And because so many of them qualified, and because they were black, the first time I went to Jamaica was in 1985. I didn't even see someone your complexion, Nadine, in the bank, unless they were the security. But what happened was, these people from the country basically came and smashed these tests to pieces. And so what they did was they legislated against them because they didn't want darker skinned Africans in banks or in this or in that, heading up schools. And Horace Campbell speaks about that in Rasta and Resistance, because that's one of the other pull factors for us to come to the UK as well. And I think it's important that we contextualize that, because for me, I'm doing an event somewhere in Tottenham for Windrush where I'm going to play some tunes and chat some lyrics. And when my mum was around, peace be upon her, I used to go to Windrush events with her or take her, because I understand how we should frame it. It's when we collapse it, put on this myopic stance, that is the only moment that matters in our history. Because one of the things that, Patrick just said, and I totally agree with it, our students go to universities and should be shining, but they have something called the student attainment gap. And the only reason I know about this is because I worked at the last university I was working on. Because lo and behold, after I was there for a couple of years, I was invited to a conference in Birmingham. And they said, these are people from the Vice Chancellor Executive, we've invited Les because he's never had a student attainment gap. And they wondered why. The student attainment gap works like this. You can have a black student and a white student with exactly the same qualifications, let's say the same A-levels. They can go and do exactly the same degree, deliver the same standard of work, but the white student invariably graduates with a first, and the black student a 2-1. And I can tell you how this happens, because I've witnessed it, tried to challenge it. The black student will get 69. The white student will get 70. That can literally be the difference between a first-class degree. And I've witnessed it. And if we don't factor these things in, sorry to cut you, if we don't factor these things into the conversation, we're going to have, as Prof. Gus always says, completely wrong-headed discussions.
You see, these conversations are so triggering because all of us have had variations of this experience. But what I think is really important is that Windrush was, it shined, as you said, Prof. Les, a beacon onto what's happening. And as Patrick said, for a much broader and wider audience, So how do you think, and this is a question for each of you, we can utilize that beam and shine that light into even darker places? How can we use this as part of our own advocacy and our own strategies for equity, justice, and inclusion?
There's two things that just so you see. There's a picture behind me. There's a picture. It's the British West Indies Regiment, taken 1916 in Egypt. My dad's uncle served in that regiment. So let's talk about the First World War. Let's talk about the experiences of Caribbean people during that period of time. Let's even go further back. So I think the Windrush is good on one level, but it has to be a jumping point to explore the other historical injustices, because the men that served in the British West Indies Regiment were hardly paid. The Italians were treated even better than the actual West Indians that were serving in the First World War. The prisoners of war had better food, better conditions. So let's look at that. And then if you roll the clock forward, I'm into Afrofuturism, and I think what I notice is that a lot of us, particularly, we don't think about the future. We spend so much of our energies thinking about the struggling, surviving, but we need to start thinking about the future. What sort of future do Black people need to have, not just in Britain, but on this planet? It's a fundamental question. It's a big question that we've not really explored, and that's what I like about Afrofuturism. It gives you the permission to explore different realities, different futures. And I remember doing some workshops with young people last year, and their mindset was so fixed on just trying to get a job, or if not trying to get a job, start a social enterprise. They weren't thinking of the bigger picture, and that's why if you look at the history of world movements, and from Marcus Garvey, from Garveyism to Pan-Africanism, even socialism that was taking place during the time of Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. These were big ideas about mobilizing people. I'm not quite sure, Black Lives Matter for a while did in America, and how it extended in the UK for a while did do that, but we've lost that kind of that mass movement. The Marcus Garvey still has the biggest organization historically around movements around the world. And that was before the age of internet and before TikTok. So what's happening?
Yeah. For me, and you've nailed it. One of the things about my writing from when I first started writing, when I was doing my undergraduate program, is I talk about transcendence. I do not lock us into resistance, because if we were not transcendental people, we would not be here having this conversation. The white racists who created their racial hierarchies, and I get into these conversations with people, they say, oh, racism is like 1,000 years old. To me, systemic institutionalized racism that gave primacy to particular types of whites is maybe 400 or 500 years old. And it's definitely not premised on African inferiority, 100%. It was constructed and manufactured to ensure that, I think it was Hobbes or John Locke, one of them said, we basically I'll paraphrase, we want to create a world where the lowest white person has a higher standing than the greatest African chief. Now, that's not based on mental or capacity, intellectual capacity. That is based on race. So for me, I know that if the white world had their way, we would have come here. They would have remember, for us and people from Southeast Asia and from the Caribbean or Africa, we came here under the 5-year myth of return. We're going to come here for 5 years, make enough money, go home, get the hell out. They were so racist here that my father in 1951, after the third white person tried to spit in his face, he bought a house. So my father bought a house in 1952 or something. through partner and susu, or whatever you want to call it. And we need to be very clear on that. And I agree with Patrick about why we should be future oriented. And there are so many things we could go into that we haven't got time today. But I've traveled Africa quite extensively. And last year I was working with a wonderful sister called Sese Sita, who I taught first at Goldsmith Sociology in 2002. She did our Global Black Studies, Decolonization, Social Justice Masters when I was running that at the uni I just left. And she invited me over to Equatorial Guinea. And they are the only Spanish-speaking colony on the continent, Equatorial Guinea. Okay? And when I was there reasoning with some of these young people who Sese works with, we're talking about from 9 to maybe 20, they are the future. Africa has the youngest population. It is the least polluted continent. It has the most potential. It is the only continent on the planet that can be self-sufficient in the context of every resource. Why are we not focusing on that as our future? And don't get me wrong, because I love the Caribbean, and we should invest in the Caribbean, or we should invest on the continent. But more importantly, we need to invest in our minds, because I believe if you feed the mind correctly, the best will follow. That's what I believe. And that for me is what we need to do. We are transcendental people. So we shouldn't wallow in this happened to us and it's all we're good. In Jamaica, they got a saying. And I remember I was doing a talk at University of West Indies once. And I said, in Jamaica, there's a saying, if I've got bad luck, them say assault. And I say, you aren't assaulted. You were assaulted, but you've forgotten who assaulted you. Once you remember that and you liberate your mind and your thinking, you will become a transcendental person overnight. Because you will see the reason why white supremacist thought and action exists is because they know we are not inferior to them. We educated them. I had this conversation with somebody the other day. We educated the Greeks and the Romans and the people from Crete and Minoa. We did that. They know that. They never denied it. So why are we almost acting as if we can be trapped in particular historical moments of what we in Rastafari call dampression? No, we need to understand what our potentials are. And whether it's through Afrofuturism or just taking a look at the world around you and thinking, do you know what? Why am I trapped in this little mud ball called England when there's a wonderful continent out there for me, or a beautiful planet?
So I'm gonna stop you now, right? I don't disagree with what you said, but there are now 3rd, 4th, or 5th generation people whose great-great-grandparents were born in the Caribbean that are living in England. The largest growing minority population in Britain are people who are mixed race, and they tend to have English white mothers.
Yeah.
So for those people who might not have the same cultural connection or political affiliations to Africa or even the Caribbean, how can those of us that are living here, that are still advocating or are still activists for equity, justice, and inclusion, how can the Windrush scandal or example be used as a way to help their futures become brighter? And this is my final question to you both.
Right. So me very quickly on that. We get really trapped in these race things. I'll give you an example. My grandfather is called Bakra Willie. You know what Bakra means in Jamaica? What does it mean?
Master.
No, it doesn't. It means
Bakra doesn't mean master.
No.
Bakra means, I always thought it meant master.
No, Bakra means
Bakra
white.
means white. Which language is that? That has to have come from an African language.
I don't know which African language it is.
Okay, I always thought it meant master.
No, it doesn't.
What does Busha mean? Busha is master. Bakra is white and Busha is master.
Bakra is white. My grandfather on my mother's side was called Bakra Willie. Whether it's biological or not, I don't know. But one of the things what I would say, instead of thinking about this notion of mixed race people with white mothers, because a white mother is still a parent of a black child. She's still a black parent, whether she likes it or not. Just like a white father is a black parent, because they've got black children. This ain't Jamaica where they can be red or brown. In England, you're black or you're white. My crucial point is this, and it's interesting because I was having this conversation last week with Les Back, and we're going to have a reasoning and maybe write something on it. For me, what is the danger for these generations is Black British, because there is no African connection. If you were Afro-Caribbean, although we can say the title was clumsy, at least it rooted you back to that continental space. Black British doesn't. It's nebulous. So that's why a lot of them say, and I've worked with loads of young people. Patrick said he's worked with them recently. Ask them the question, what are you? I'm Black British. Why? Because I'm black and I was born in Britain. Well, you were born in England, but you can't be English.
But Les, you have people here, people here that are maybe 40 years your junior that are saying, I'm English. And they're
but they can say whatever they want.
And they believe it, Les.
No, but this is my whole point. It's the delusion. There's a guy who wrote a book. I've got it up there somewhere. That, in fact, Les Back gave it to me, and it was like being English through Negro spectacles. He wrote it in something like 1878. You can delude yourselves and call yourselves what you like. You could call yourself English. Is it in your passport? If I was born in Scotland, what would be in my passport?
Britain.
No, I'd be Scottish, wouldn't I?
Yeah. Can I respond to?
You can't be English. So if they want to claim England, good luck to them.
So one of the interesting phenomena of the whole scandal, and I've met quite a few people who, if you looked at them, you'd think they were white, but actually their grandparents were Windrush. I think there's an increase now in people wanting to do family genealogy research work on their family history. The Windrush scandal, well, for better for worse, has forced them to start to look at their identity, whereas before they didn't think about their Caribbean heritage at all. So I see that as a positive thing. So there's more and more talk of, I get lots of inquiries, lots of people I know who do black family genealogy. They're actually quite busy doing workshops, because now you've got people who now realise that they want to know the backstory of their grandparents and great grandparents, and then they realise the experience of discrimination. We need to build on that, basically, but also it raised the issue of identity and belonging in this country. As I said, there is a high degree of fragility, not just simply on the socioeconomic poverty, inequality, structural race side. There's a fragility in our identity, and where do we feel safe? Yeah. Where do we feel safe? You're doing an event in Tottenham. You go to Tottenham, a lot of young people don't feel safe there. You go to Hackney, they don't feel safe in Hackney. You go to Birmingham, they don't feel safe in Birmingham. So where do people feel safe? Yeah. This is a big question now. I'm not talking about postcode lottery safeness. I'm talking about being safe in a growing, hostile, fascist environment when you got Tommy Robinson and his crew marching proudly, knowing full well that they can get away with everything. Absolutely. To go back. I mean, you grew up in Lewisham, so you know what happened back in the day in Lewisham, back in the 70s. It happened in Wolverhampton. We had to beat the BNP and tell them on the National Front. They're coming back again. So I'm just hoping that these young people are ready for them, that we've dealt with them.
Yeah. So I'll tell you what is really interesting about that, and this will be my last point, and I have to love you and leave you, but who knows, hopefully we'll do something again. But what is really interesting about that is, if you go back to Thatcher, 79 to 83, how she targeted, for me, she was targeting the white working class, and we got caught up in that, and then they targeted us. But by closing all the youth clubs, you created this whole idea of this postcode foolishness. And I've done this, I've written about it. Myself and Dr. Sarita Mullins-Lawrence wrote a chapter on this a few years ago. Because what people don't realise is, me and Patrick could have been in the same dances in Birmingham in the 70s, because we used to travel from London to go and listen to like Quaker City and people like that. Do you understand me? It was our reality. We could go anywhere. And don't get me wrong, there was Brixton Boys versus Peckham Boys versus whatever. that existed. In fact, the longest battle between the New Cross boys and the Peckham boys was something like 1902 to 1903. They were all white gangs and they fought for something like 5 days. You can check the history out. My point is this. Once they shut all the youth centres, the sound system culture started to die because every youth centre had a sound system.
Yeah.
And we used to be able to travel across London to go and listen to other sound systems. I'm talking my lived experience. Once all of these youth centres and spaces like that were closed, you found black and white working class children on the streets because where else could they go? The difference is, and people have written about this, the generation, and if we link it to the Windrush generation, when you're, let's say myself and my twin brother, 1968, 1969, we're 12 or 13. We might be 5'2". By 1972, we're 6 foot. We become more visible. And that's what happened. They started to see a swelling of a black presence on the street. An average white person them time was probably, 5'8". And these forms of visibility are what need to be factored in, as well as the way Margaret Thatcher legislated against us as African Caribbean people. Because whenever I do a talk on the Windrush or anything to do with so-called gang violence, nihilistic behavior, I say to them, you need to realize, why are you afraid to travel across London? We did a project at summer school in 2006. We had 15 young people aged, they were supposed to be 15 to 18, but my 2 daughters were there. One was 12, one was 15. 11 of those young people had never traveled across London. Never. The only area they knew was their little ends. We took them across London. We took them to the British Library. We took them to the British Museum. We took them to Jetstar Records that used to be in Willesden to interview Maccabee. Some of them, it was the first time they got on a tube in London, 2006. So when we talk about this kind of parochial, myopic vision and mentality, we need to historically frame it. And maybe in some ways, that is really good that the Windrush scandal has shined that beacon on that, because it's made a lot of black people realize that they are too complacent. And if you're complacent, you're complicit in your own destruction. And the final point is this. How many black people do you know, African Caribbean, of my generation, I'm 67 years old, who were born in Jamaica but have never been back? When I got back to Jamaica for? Why am I going back to Africa? It's blah, blah, blah. Because somebody has made them think that they came from some kind of savagery or whatever. I hope you enjoyed it, but give fun.
So I'll just recap the question again. The Windrush scandal is a jump-off point. It presents an opportunity for a beacon or a light to be shined in other places. Going forward, how can we use this opportunity to support people that are from younger generations than ourselves, have more justice, more equity, and to be included?
If you look at changes in Britain over the last 70 odd years, if you look at the 1965 Race Relations Act, there were 2 key factors that led to that act being created. The Bristol boycott, led by Paul Stevenson and others in 1963, and the creation of the organisation called Campaign Against Racial Discrimination, which involved a number of black, white and Asian activists as well. Those 2 factors influenced Parliament to lead to the 65 Act and 68 Act. If you look at people in high places in the public sector, there were a number of Windrush people back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s who started to break down the barriers for people to be where I am now, chairing a large NHS organisation as well, in terms of local government, housing, civil service. If you look at in terms of entrepreneurship, there were actually a number of amazing businesses, black businesses, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So the question we asked ourselves: if the Windrush generation were pioneers, then if you follow that trajectory, then we should be running places, running things. But what's happened between that period, that generation, which were the pioneers? Remember, and they faced more racism and discrimination. When you talk about ethnicity pay gap, it was like an ocean. It wasn't a little thing. It was, So one of the things that we have to learn is, one of the key messages, I think, from that Windrush, that period, was they had a high degree of resilience. Do we have that high degree of resilience now as we move forward in terms of the next couple of generations? Because I think a lot of people think, because of the hard work done by that generation, and in terms of changes in law, what happened with Darkest Hour and the Black Panthers, they were part of that generation as well. So I think what's happened is, because we've made all these gains, we've changed aspects of law, culture, and society. People don't see that we've done that, or don't even acknowledge that we've done that. And the beneficiaries of those think that it's all right, as long as I have a podcast, not apart from this one, you know what I mean. I'm all right, but you're not all right, because you're not looking at the structural issues. So we need to learn from that generation, because they dealt with a lot of stuff that, and some of them haven't even shared half that story, to be quite honest. That is why it's important to not talk about how well they look dressed and partied, but some of the strategies they used to survive. And I don't think we've actually learned from some of those strategies. Like you talk about the partner system, that was created because banks didn't want to give money to black people to start their own businesses or buy their own homes. But people did that. But we've just lost. I think we've just lost. Either we've lost it, or they've not passed on the baton in a way to say, here is this guidebook to deal with racism in Britain, adapt it for the 22nd century. We've not done that. So there has to be more dialogue, particularly.
I'm sorry to cut you. I know we got to close now, but I think there's a couple of things. One of the sayings I've been saying from time is, knowledge gives us the power to enslave or liberate. It's entirely up to us what we do with the knowledge. Because to me, knowledge has been racialized, but it shouldn't be. If it's knowledge, I don't care who it comes from. You can use it, you can interpret it, whatever. That's one thing. So knowledge gives us the power to enslave or liberate. Depends on what we want to do. Okay. The second thing is, and I think, this may be caveated into what Patrick just said, or factored in, whichever. In some ways, the black community, the African Caribbean community, when we were Afro-Caribbeans, or however we styled ourselves, we knew exactly who the enemy was. And I'm not saying we knew that everybody who looked like us were skin folk, kinfolk. I'm not saying that. But for me, it's not dissimilar from America under Jim Crow. You knew who you could trade with. You knew where you stood. That's not evident nowadays. And I think that's one of the things that people need to be educated in. They need to realize that just because you are in a particular position, socially, culturally, politically classed, don't think that you belong. The skin you're in determines that you don't belong. And until I think we really deal with that reality, we will have this conversation in another 20 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah,
Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you so much, both of you. Our producer is saying we need a part 2, so we will definitely be back in touch. Thank you so much.
All right, and give him thanks
for your time.
Thank you,
and Prof. Les, thank you so much. And it was such a powerful exchange, because what you successfully did, which I hoped you would do, is broaden the discussion and enlighten us. So thank you for that.
We'll give him thanks.
Well, it's a pleasure. It really is.